Something changed. You can't name it precisely, but something is different about how you sit at the platform now. Not confidence. You've had confidence before. It collapsed under drawdown. Not certainty. You know better than to expect that now. Not even calm, because calm can be numbness, and this isn't numbness. It's something closer to clarity, a kind of cold, clean seeing. Setup appears. You look at it. No hope attached. No fear attached. No narrative about what it means if it works or doesn't work. Just, what is actually here? System criteria present or not present? Risk-reward favorable or not favorable? Entry valid or not valid? The decision is clean. Execute or don't execute. And either way, you move to the next moment. This is new. Not because you learned something new, but because something that was distorting your perception burned away. The fire of the previous stages did something you couldn't predict. It didn't just burn the behaviors, it burned the lens through which you were seeing the market. And now, for perhaps the first time, you're seeing something closer to what's actually there. The alchemists had a name for this stage. After the blackening, after the breakdown and the death of what you thought you were, comes the whitening. Not triumph, not arrival, but purification of perception. The first stage where consciousness stops distorting what it observes quite so completely. This is not the end of the work. The alchemists were explicit. This is an intermediate stage. Clarity without the reintegration of strength is incomplete. But it's the first time you can see the market as it actually is, rather than as you needed it to be. And that changes everything about what execution means. This episode is about albedo, the whitening, the purification of perception that follows the fire. What it feels like in a live session, what it reveals about everything you called your trading psychology, and the specific danger it carries that destroys traders who mistake clarity for completion. This is the great map, and this is the first light after the burning. Here's what the purification reveals first. Everything you called my trading psychology was constructed, not discovered, built. I'm a disciplined trader. You told yourself this, built identity around it, created rules as evidence of it. Then Nigredo happened. Breakdown showed you break rules under pressure, consistently, predictably. Calcination burned, the attachment to being seen as disciplined, the performance of discipline, the ego that needed the identity of disciplined trader to survive. And now albedo clarifies. Discipline was never your nature. It was your aspiration dressed as identity. But here's what's different now. Before Nigredo and calcination, seeing this would have produced shame, collapse, defensive rationalization. That was different. Those conditions were unusual. I'm generally disciplined. Now you see it cleanly, without the defensive editing. The pattern is visible as pattern, not as moral failure, not as evidence of inadequacy. Just, when 3 consecutive losses occur, position sizing increases on the next trade. Always. without exception in the last 8 months of data. That's not a character flaw. It's a psychological pattern with identifiable origin and predictable trigger. Seeing it clearly doesn't require defending against it anymore, because the ego that needed to be disciplined has burned. I'm a rational trader. Albedo reveals rationality was a defense against feeling uncertainty, not a genuine capacity. You see it now in real time. I'm adding another indicator to this analysis. Am I adding it because I need more information, or because I don't want to execute and the analysis gives me permission to wait? That distinction between genuine analytical need and emotional avoidance wearing analysis as costume was invisible before. Now it's observable. Not always comfortable to observe, but observable. The market is irrational. The market is manipulated. This shouldn't be happening. Albedo reveals every accusation directed at the market was projection. Your own irrationality projected outward because you couldn't see it inward. Your own need for control projected as market manipulation when control was denied. Your own narrative requirements projected as "this shouldn't happen" when reality violated your model. The market doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to move. The requirement that it makes sense was always yours. Albedo doesn't make this pleasant. It makes it visible. And visibility, clear, non-defensive visibility of what you actually are as a trader, is the purification. Not cleansing, not becoming pure, but seeing purely. The difference is everything. Something develops during albedo that wasn't available before. Depth psychology calls it witness consciousness, the capacity to observe your own psychological processes without being fully identified with them. In trading, this is perhaps the most operationally significant development in the entire transformation. Before albedo, you are the trade, psychologically inside it completely. Price moves against position. The movement is happening to you. Personally, the threat is existential, not financial. Stop approaching. Something in you prepares to defend, fight, or flee. The stop is not a risk management tool. It's a judgment about your worth as a trader. Winner developing. You are the winner. The win is proof of what you needed proved. During albedo, something separates. A gap appears between what's happening and your response to what's happening. Price moves against position. You observe. Price is moving against my position. Simultaneously, you observe, I'm feeling anxiety about this movement. Simultaneously, you observe, the anxiety is generating an impulse to move the stop. Simultaneously, you observe, I'm watching myself about to move the stop. That final observation, watching yourself about to do the thing, is witness consciousness operating. And in that watching, something becomes possible that wasn't possible before. Choice. Not elimination of the impulse, not suppression of the anxiety, not heroic willpower overriding emotion, but a space between the impulse and the action. Small, sometimes only seconds wide, but there. And in that space, the stop doesn't move. Not because you forced it not to, because you saw what was happening clearly enough that the automated response lost its authority. Mark Douglas spent years trying to articulate this. The professional trader still feels the fear, still feels the impulse, but doesn't act from it. Not through discipline, through something that functions differently than discipline. Witness consciousness is the mechanism, the capacity to observe the fear without being the fear, to observe the impulse without obeying the impulse. Revenge trade. You feel the anger after the loss. You observe the anger generating the narrative, I need to recover this. You observe the narrative generating the search for the next trade. You observe yourself opening the chart, looking for something that isn't there, and you close the platform. Not through willpower, through seeing clearly what was about to happen. Set up after series of losses, you feel the residual state from the previous losses. You observe the fear of another loss coloring your perception of the setup. You observe yourself looking for reasons not to take it that aren't in the system. And you ask, is this analysis, or is this the previous loss speaking? The question is only possible because there's a witness to ask it, a part of consciousness that isn't fully identified with the fear. This doesn't eliminate difficulty. Albedo is not comfort, but it transforms the relationship between psychological states and execution decisions. States still arise. They always will, but they stop automatically determining outcomes. The first operation of Albedo is specific. Pull your last 100 trades. Not to optimize your system, not to improve your edge, to see what's actually there without ego editing the view. This is different from the journaling you did before Nigredo and Calcination, before the fire. When you reviewed trades, ego was present as defense attorney, finding justifications, contextualizing failures, emphasizing wins, creating narrative that preserved identity. That loss was because of the news event. This win confirmed my analysis was correct. The drawdown that month was unusual conditions. Now you look at the data differently. Not, what story does this tell about me? But, what patterns are actually here? Specific questions that Ablution asks. After how many consecutive losses does my position sizing change? Pull the data. Don't estimate. Count. What's the time distribution of my worst trades? Early session when I'm still calibrating? Late session when I'm fatigued? After significant wins when I'm inflated? What's my win rate on trades I took with high conviction versus trades I took mechanically following the system? Which is higher? That last question is particularly confronting for traders who've operated from conviction. Often, mechanical system execution outperforms high conviction trades, significantly. Because high conviction is often the feeling function erupting as certainty, and certainty, as we've established, has no edge in a probabilistic market. The courage Ablution requires is specific, to remain with what you see without immediately constructing defense. When data shows your worst performance consistently follows your best weeks, and you recognize the pattern of inflation and collapse, to see that without immediately explaining it away. The data is what it is. The pattern is what it is. Ego wants to contextualize. Albedo requires you to see first, contextualize after. And sometimes, the context doesn't change the pattern. It just explains the origin. The most operationally important capacity Albedo develops? The ability to distinguish between a valid setup and the emotional need for a trade. Before the fire, these felt identical. The urgency to enter after 3 losses felt exactly like the recognition of a genuine opportunity. The compulsion to trade when session was slow felt exactly like the identification of a valid setup. The need to recover drawdown before close felt exactly like the perception of late session opportunity. You couldn't tell the difference from inside the experience. Both generated entry. Both felt justified in the moment. Albedo develops the capacity to separate them. Not perfectly, not always, but with increasing reliability. The test. Before entry, 1 question. Can I describe this setup entirely in terms of my system without any reference to my current emotional state? Valid setup. Price has returned to the level I defined as entry in my system. Risk is 0.8%. Target produces 2.4 R. My system says execute. No reference to how you feel. No reference to what happened earlier in the session. No reference to what you need from this trade. Emotional need disguised as setup. This looks like a good opportunity here. It feels right after the morning. I think this is going to move. Feeling language. Vague criteria. Reference to earlier session. Conviction language without systematic foundation. The separation isn't always clean. Markets are ambiguous. Genuine setups sometimes feel uncertain. Emotional needs sometimes attach to genuinely valid trades. But the practice of asking the question consistently before every entry develops the discriminating capacity over time. And over time you notice, when you can't describe the setup in system terms, the outcomes are significantly worse. The data confirms what consciousness is developing the capacity to see. Albedo is not a state you reach and maintain. It's a cycle. And understanding the cycle prevents a specific trap. You develop witness consciousness around a specific pattern. Revenge trading, for example. You observe the anger. You observe the impulse. You observe the narrative. You close the platform instead of executing the revenge trade. 3 weeks pass. You haven't revenge traded. You conclude, I've resolved this. Then a different trigger activates the same underlying structure. Not the same 3 consecutive losses, but a different context. Larger loss on a single trade, or public accountability, someone watching your session, and the pattern returns. Different surface, same root. This isn't failure. This is distillation. The first cycle of observation purified 1 layer. The next cycle works deeper. Revenge trading after 3 small losses. First layer. Resolved. Revenge trading after 1 significant loss that triggered identity threat. Deeper layer. Now visible. The mistake is treating each cycle as regression. I thought I was past this. You're not past it. You're through the first layer and into the second. The alchemists understood. The material goes back into the furnace. Not because the first calcination failed, because each calcination purifies a different depth of the same material. Your trading journal, maintained honestly across months, shows this spiral. The same category of problem, position sizing, stop management, session termination, appearing at progressively subtler levels. Each appearance is not failure. Each appearance is the next layer becoming visible. Albedo is patient with this process in a way ego never was. Because witness consciousness understands, this is how purification works, not linearly, cyclically. Albedo carries a specific danger that none of the previous stages carried in this form. The danger of Nigredo was breakdown without container. dissolution without structure to hold the process. The danger of calcination was leaving the furnace prematurely, escaping the heat before the burning completed. The danger of albedo is different, more subtle, more seductive, mistaking clarity for completion. You've developed witness consciousness. You can observe your patterns without full identification. You've stopped revenge trading. Your position sizing is consistent. Your stop management has stabilized. You look at where you were 18 months ago, and the distance is significant, real, earned. And something happens that feels like wisdom but isn't. You conclude, I've done the psychological work. I understand trading psychology now. That conclusion is inflation, not pride in the colloquial sense, a specific psychological inflation, the ego reclaiming authority in a new form. Instead of, I'm a disciplined trader, as the inflated identity, now it's, I'm a psychologically transformed trader. Different content, same structure. How inflation manifests at this stage. You begin analyzing other traders' psychological problems with the clarity you've developed about your own. Accurately, often. But the attention moves outward precisely when deeper inward work remains. You significantly increase position size during the period of albedo clarity. I'm finally in the right psychological state to trade larger. But albedo is clarity of perception. It is not yet the full integration of strength required to trade larger without the deeper structures being tested again at new scale. New scale finds old patterns at new depth. Every trader who increased size prematurely during a good psychological period discovers this. The test of inflation versus genuine development is specific. When your next significant drawdown arrives, and it will, what happens to the witness consciousness? If witness consciousness is genuine, you observe the drawdown producing the old patterns at diminished intensity. You see clearly. You continue the process. If inflation, the drawdown collapses the clarity. Witness consciousness disappears under the pressure of actual loss. The patterns return at previous intensity. The clarity was state-dependent, not structural. Genuine albedo is not eliminated by drawdown. It's tested by it, and survives the test. There's a specific experience albedo produces that nothing in trading psychology literature adequately documents. You've seen that your beliefs about yourself as a trader were constructed. Disciplined was performance. Rational was defense. Consistent was aspiration. Nigredo and calcination burned these constructions. And albedo shows you they were constructions, clearly, undeniably. And then the question arrives, quietly, persistently. If none of that was real, if those were all constructed identities that burned away, then who is actually sitting here executing trades? Let that land. This is the existential vertigo of albedo. Not the overwhelming crisis of Nigredo, not the acute burning of calcination. Something more unsettling in its quietness. A philosophical uncertainty about the nature of the agent executing. It shows up in the session like this. Setup appears, valid by system. You observe the impulse to execute. You observe the thought confirming validity. You observe the decision forming. You observe the hand moving toward the mouse. And you pause. Not from hesitation about the trade, but from a sudden strange question. Which of these observations is me? The impulse? The thought? The decision? The observation of all three? This is not dissociation. It's not pathology. It's the witness consciousness developing to the point where it can observe the observing, where consciousness becomes aware of its own constructive processes. And the ego, which always required a stable identity to function, doesn't know what to do with that level of observation. The answer doesn't come from thinking about it. It comes from continuing to execute while the question remains open. The professional trader acts despite uncertainty. The deepest version of this isn't uncertainty about the trade, it's uncertainty about the trader. And the discovery that Albedo eventually produces, execution doesn't require certainty about who is executing. It requires clarity about what the system says. The question, who is executing, has no final answer. And the discovery that execution doesn't need one is itself a form of liberation. You execute from the witness, from the clarity, from the process, not from identity, not from certainty about selfhood, from the clean seeing that Albedo produced. Here's what execution looks like from inside Albedo. Not as aspiration, as description. Setup appears. You look at it. System criteria present. You execute. The decision carries no weight beyond the decision itself. No history attached. Not the losses from last week that this trade could begin to recover. Not the wins from yesterday that this trade could confirm were not luck. Not the identity question of whether you're good enough at this. Just, is this valid by my system? Yes. Execute. Loss. Stop hit. Clean execution of defined risk. You register it. Journal entry. What was the setup? What was the outcome? Was execution consistent with system? Yes. You close the journal. Open the chart. Look for next setup. The loss is not echoing, not because you've suppressed it, because witness consciousness observed it, registered it, classified it, system loss, not behavior error, and allowed it to complete without amplification. The next setup receives identical attention as if the loss hadn't occurred. Because in terms of what this setup is, the previous loss is irrelevant. This setup has its own probability, unaffected by what came before. Win. Target hit. Clean exit. You register it. Journal entry. Setup, outcome, execution quality. Consistent with system. No inflation. No evidence seeking. No, this proves I've figured it out. Just, this particular trade in this particular probability distribution resolved favorably. Next setup receives identical process, because the win doesn't change what the next setup is either. End of session. P and L is a number. You examine. Was execution consistent with system across the session? Where were the deviations? What triggered them? What does this tell you about the next layer of pattern work? P and L is data for financial management. Execution quality is data for psychological development. They're related, but they're not the same information. And confusing them is what Albedo finally allows you to stop doing. The alchemists were precise about one thing. The white stone is not the philosopher's stone. Albedo is not the completion of the work. Clarity without strength is incomplete. The trader in Albedo can see with unusual precision, can observe patterns without full identification, can execute more cleanly than at any previous stage. But Albedo is predominantly receptive, reflective. The lunar consciousness the alchemists described. It illuminates, it reflects, but it doesn't yet fully act. This shows up as a specific limitation. The Albedo trader is sometimes so conscious of their patterns that observation becomes its own form of paralysis. I feel the impulse to enter, but this impulse could be emotional, so I'll observe it more carefully. Observing, observing. Setup passes. Observation continues. This isn't wisdom. It's clarity without the integrated capacity to act from clarity. The previous stages burned away false action. Action from ego, from fear, from need for validation. What remains, genuine action, action from integrated psychological structure, requires the next stage of the work. Not more burning, not more purification, reintegration. The reunion of the clarity Albedo produced with the vitality, the strength, the full embodied engagement with risk that was necessarily suspended during the burning process. That's the work ahead. Not the destruction of more false structures, but the rebuilding of authentic ones, stronger than what burned, because what rebuilds has passed through fire. But for now, recognize what albedo is. The first time you see the market without the ego's distorting lens fully operational. The first time a loss is just a loss. The first time a setup is evaluated on its own terms. The first time P and L is data and not verdict. This clarity is not comfortable. It's not warm. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like seeing. And after everything that burned, after the breakdown, after the fire, after the death of every identity you constructed around trading, seeing clearly is enough. For now, it's enough.